He's gonna try to find you. He said he really wanted to talk to you. They want to do stuff on remittances.
Yeah, because what I did is I went to the ambassador and I told her, look, we want to work here, we want to do
Okay.
something. And she says, definitely.
Yeah, I told him it's hard to confirm. He wrote to her. Yeah. Yeah.
But if you can ask him to bring cheaper.
Okay. Hello? Ah, great. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue, and thank you all for joining us. For almost 20 years now, the dialogue has been tracking and analyzing remittance flows to Latin America and the Caribbean, and also generating a variety of policy ideas to make those flows cheaper and more productive and more effective. And all of that work has been carried out under the intellectual leadership and direction of Manuel Orozco, who many of you know, who's our director for our program on remittances, development, and migration here at the Dialogue. And he's really been a pioneer in this field and started working on it when very few people were talking about remittances. Of course, now, 20 years later, everybody's talking about remittances, and I think it's widely recognized the significant role remittances play in economic growth and development in the region. I came back yesterday from a conference that the Dialogue organized in El Salvador, and of course there's a lot of talk there about the role of remittances in Salvador's economy and its very important share in the overall economic growth in El Salvador, and that's true of many other countries as well in Central America and the Caribbean. So it's very salient and relevant in the region, and of course the political landscape has changed in the United States as well, and with the new administration, which also has implications and impacts on the economies in the region and also on the U.S. economy. And of course, in the case of El Salvador, there's a lot of talk about the possible impact of the return of at least some of the 200,000 Salvadorans who are under the temporary protection status here, if that, by I guess a year and a half from now, if that is not resolved, depending on how that policy change is implemented, of course. But the Salvadorans are already preparing and trying to get ready to absorb Salvadorans who may be coming back and to reintegrate them into the economy in El Salvador. So this is an extremely important issue with a lot of different dimensions to it. And this morning, we're going to hear about new research from the Intermarket Dialogue under Manuel's direction with his colleagues, Julian Nansura and Laura Porras, on remittances in 2017, and to talk about the different aspects, I think, that are of great interest and concern, and see what changes, if any, have taken place and why they've taken place, what's happening that we should really take into account to understand why remittances have gone up. And Manuel will talk about the $75 billion last year, which is an 8% increase over the previous year. So what can we attribute all of this to? What does it mean? And what can we expect moving forward? We're extremely fortunate to have a great group of speakers here, and I want to welcome especially Leon Isaacs, who is the Chief Executive Director of Development Market Associates. This is his first time at the dialogue, so we're very, very happy that you're with us. Leon lives in London but works in Paris, or lives in Paris and works in London. I can't remember which one, but he's sort of in that. And he has a global understanding and view of remittance flows, so I think that's a very valuable perspective to have with us. And we're also thrilled to have Paul Dwyer as our good friend, who has been at the dialogue a number of times, and the Chief Executive Officer at Via Americas. He also, I think, follows this issue as closely as anybody, and has been very, very thoughtful on this question of remittances. So we have two excellent commentators, and we have a great group here, and I want to thank you again for coming. And before I turn it over to Manuel, let me also just say that, give a little plug, that next Tuesday, Manuel will be chairing and moderating a session we'll be having here at the Dialogue on a recent book that came out, produced by the International Monetary Fund, called Unleashing Growth and Strengthening Resilience in the Caribbean. And that book includes, devotes some of its analysis to the question of remittances, which obviously is relevant in the Caribbean. So that book, there will be two economists from the IMF who are presenting the results, and another commentator, Manuel, will be chairing that. That's next Tuesday from 9:30 to 11 here in this room. So we hope you can make that as well. So thank you again for coming, and let me turn it over to Manuel to get us started.
Thank you very much, Michael, and colleagues Paul and Leon, for coming to the meeting.
Is it on? I don't think it's
on. Yeah. The main storyline is that, yes, there is an increase in remittances in 2017 at a higher rate than the year before, at over 8.5% to more than $75 billion. This is a significant increase considering the international landscape and the political landscape in the United States, where more than 3/4 of the flows are originating through Latin America. The pattern really, it's to a large extent influenced by different dynamics, including increased migration, but also increased amounts sent by migrants themselves. So I want to just take a general review of some of the patterns, the determinants that explain this increase in the flows, and what it means in general for 2018, given the context that we are inaugurating this year, especially in the United States. You have the report, so you can walk with me through the report. But the main issue is that this growth, you can look at it from different perspectives. One is the key determinants that explain the flow of money. And some of those determinants have to do, again, with migration. That is, more migrants are sending money, and there are two ways in which more migrants send money. One is that as a share of the total migrant population, the number increases. So typically you have 75% of adults sending money, and sometimes the number can increase to 80%, and that can have a significant effect. Another way is that there is more migration, and that's basically one of the factors that occurs in 2017. The second way in which the increase is seen is whether migrants send more money regularly, that is on a frequent basis. You know, up until the recession, the typical frequency of sending money was 12 times a year, a religious monthly amount. Since the recession, or after the recession, I should say, the frequency actually has increased to 14, 13 times. And that's an interesting phenomenon that may explain people are managing better their disposable income and sharing it back home. But that's an interesting development. And the other one is that some intervening factors have influenced the amount sent through the principal. The principal sent also has increased for some countries. In some cases, it's an effect of the use of, for example, mobile technology, internet systems. But in general, in some cases, you see also an increase happening. But outside of that, the first step is to look at where this flow is growing mostly by nationality. And we find that there are basically 7 countries, predominantly Central America and the Caribbean, plus Colombia, where the increase in remittances exceeded 10% growth. And that's a substantive amount that is predominantly coming from countries like Colombia, Haiti, Guatemala, Honduras, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. And in most of these cases, the key factor behind it is migration. But the fact that you have a substantive increase really raises the question as to what explains that. These countries combined basically represent half of the flows of remittances to Latin America. These 17 countries capture 97% of all flows to Latin America. So while the Western Hemisphere has more than 30 countries, these 17 countries capture the large majority or the overwhelming flows to the region. Now, if we looked at the determining factors, what we see basically is that to a large extent, this growth is explained by migration coming predominantly from countries in Central America and Haiti. The Northern Triangle countries, for example, have experienced substantive migration since the post-recession period. We estimate that at least 300,000 Central Americans leave the region to mostly come to the United States, and of those, at least 1/3 makes it to the US. And that increase in remittances is partly explained by that influx. The large majority of those that come within the 2017 period come mostly for economic reasons. However, in the past 2 years, there's been an increase of the reasons explained related to insecurity and violence, increases that went from 18% in 2016 to 20%, 21% in 2017. So that factors has come across more saliently in the Central America region. The other country that is interesting to note is Haiti. Haitian migration exploded since the earthquake in 2010, and it went basically to different parts of the world. 2 main regions were South America and North America. South America, Brazil, and more recently, Chile. There is a huge outflow of Haitians today going to Chile. There are estimated at least 100,000 Haitians in Chile, which is, Chile historically has not been predominantly a migrant host country, except for Peruvians, who traditionally worked in the domestic work segment. But basically in the past 10 years, or even the past 5 years, Chilean economy has hosted an increased number of migrants from Bolivia, from other countries, and more recently from Haiti. The first notice of migration to Chile was observed from Colombia. Colombians going to Chile in large numbers, and now is Haiti. Haiti really is experiencing a large increase to the extent to which there are nearly 2 million Haitians living abroad. We'll see later that the Haitian economy basically functions on a basis of remittances received. 30% of GDP is after Tajikistan, is the second country, the largest recipient of remittances relative to GDP in the world. And this change occurs basically since the reconstruction process. You will have thought that the reconstruction process will have improved the economy in the country, but in fact, it has stagnated quite dramatically. Other factors explaining the growth include changes in the amount remitted. And here, the question is why? So one factor that has a relatively a marginal explanation is the method of sending. In the marketplace, we have noticed that the use of internet-based transfers, mobile transfers, or web portals to send money has increased in the past 10 years from 1% to 9% last year. So it's a major increase over the past 10 years. However, there is another factor that may have influenced the flow, and that has been the political landscape in the United States. Last year, we did a survey of migrants sending money, and we also asked them, how do they feel about, the prospect of deportation? Do you feel you may get deported, or someone will be deported? Are you afraid of just the rhetoric that is out there? And over half of these migrants were afraid of the rhetoric, but 1 in 3 basically was certain that they will be deported. Whether that's the case or not, it has a psychological effect on their sending. And when you look at the numbers, when we asked them, how much are you sending? They were sending far higher amounts than those who that they have the average remitted. It's a substantive increase in the flow that they send on a regular basis. Now, when you plug in the numbers, a lot of that increase in the principal remitted is associated to this number. I think the actual principal amount, you can see it on the table 7. And for Guatemala and Honduras, for example, the increase in the amount remitted on an annual basis, on a monthly basis, is significant. For Honduras, it's 12%. For Guatemala, it's 9%. And so that does have an effect on the entire annual inflow of money. In fact, in a project we're doing in Guatemala, we found out that 17% of remittance recipients were receiving money from a relative who left in 2017. So there is a lot of correspondence between migration on the one hand, and on the other hand, on the increased amount of the principal. So looking, in general, to these determinants, there are quite important considerations to make in regards to the significance of remittances vis-a-vis the economies of these countries. More importantly, for those countries that have experienced the highest growth. And that is that these are economies that basically are functioning predominantly on 5 or 6 economic activities: agricultural exports, the free trade zone, the outsourcing economy, or maquilas as we call it, migration, tourism, and that's predominantly it. Nearly 50% of GDP comes from those economic activities, and then the informal economy. So these are economies that predominantly don't have much to work on. Their productivity levels are significantly low. And in the lack of opportunities in their home country, with the combined effect of continued violence, out-migration occurs almost as a logical step. I mean, when we look at the trends in Central America, for example, in the Northern Triangle, the homicide rates in last year they all experienced, except for Guatemala, a drop that was basically of 10%, from 14 homicides in Honduras to 12, from 13 homicides in El Salvador, daily homicides, to 11. So, of course, from a government perspective, governments feel comfortable that there's been a decline in violence, but relatively looking at the broader picture, this is peanuts compared to the fact that the prospect of staying of your country may mean you may be killed at some point. The impact, in fact, when we looked at the broader perspective, is telling you of something that is more relevant, and that is that those countries that are more remittance dependent are also those countries where state fragility is the greatest. And state fragility can be measured in different ways. One of them is basically the inability of the state to protect their citizens. Another way is the constant or regular political instability that occurs on your daily politics. And that factor is really relevant for Latin America. We find a strong correlation between the flow of remittances, which is connected to migration, and the pattern of state fragility in the Americas. Now, just as a final element, you have the fact that some of the countries with state fragility happen to be countries that, in fact, many nationals were under temporary protected status in the United States. We're talking about more than 300,000 people so far from El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Haiti. And as you know, the storyline is saying that their status basically has been terminated or will end within the next 18 months for the majority of these groups. The significance of that is quite important on many regards. One is that, of course, if conditions in these countries having improved, it's hard to imagine that a return of this population will actually do good to the countries and to themselves. The second aspect is the extent to which people will actually decide to return. And when you look at the cost benefits of staying and going, the considerations of looking at the fear for your life on the one hand, and perhaps the ties that you have established for people who have been more than 20 years, that also will have an impact on the decision to be made. Either way, that will have an effect on the economies of these countries, and especially those countries that are related to those four nationalities, plus Guatemala in particular. And that's because a lot, at least 2/3 of the economic growth that these countries registered is predominantly attributed to the inflow of remittances. For a country of El Salvador, for example, that experienced a 2.4 growth rate, equivalent to $600 million, just that flow is explained by the outflow of remittances sent by Salvadorans under TPS. So, the very fragile economic growth that these countries are having is significantly sustained by the inflow of remittances. So that context really raises the questions about the implications for continuous state fragility in the Americas. And I'll stop here.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Manuel. It's useful. And we start with Paul, maybe, and then you could give the Paul. Thank you.
I don't know. Hello? No. Yeah. Is it on? Okay. Well, thank you, Michael, for your kind words earlier, and Manuel, thank you for the invitation to comment on this study. The dialogue plays such an important role in the remittance ecosystem. I won't even call it a marketplace, because as a private business, I often look at these numbers, look at this information from the perspective of a business and how we're operating, how we're competing in an intensely competitive environment. And studies like this are an opportunity to step back and reflect on the broader context of the volume of flows, but also the setting in which these flows occur. if you look at the average send amounts that are reflected in Table 7, and you stop to reflect for a moment on the relatively tiny size of the individual transactions and the enormous size of the aggregate transactions, what's in the middle of that is a very, very large number of people that have made a fundamental decision in how they organize their lives and how they sacrifice for their families in order to try to either escape an insecure and violent situation or simply get ahead. And remittances in that context are really the safety valve that allows a hemispheric economy to continue to thrive and prosper in an environment where growth rates are vastly different between different, and economic opportunity for individuals is vastly different between country and country. And as we look at what has happened in 2017, and with the benefit of the excellent research that's reflected in the paper, being able to dissect a little bit the reasons for the aggregate increase, one that stands out is simply the demand for labor in the United States. In one sense, this is the fact that remittances have increased as much as they have is an indication of a wonderfully healthy economy that is demanding labor at a rate that this marketplace, these senders are happy to step in and provide. That is a sign of good health on the send side in the economic sense. Conversely, on the receive side, the economic insecurity, the political insecurity that drives people to make a difficult decision to migrate is a push factor, and both of these are very important. And if you step back and think about that from the perspective of United States national security, this is a good thing. It's a good thing that this safety valve exists. It's a good thing that workers are able to contribute the way that they are contributing to the national economies through their hard work and the remittance of the funds, the benefits of that hard work back to support their families. It is not in the national interest of the United States to disrupt these flows. It's not in the national interest of the United States to have failed states, fragile economies that are dependent on these flows. It's not in the national interest of the United States to deprive private employers in the United States of the needed labor that they are employing by employing the people that are coming to work and send money home and simply want to live in peace. They want to live in peace wherever they can, whether it's at home with economic opportunity or in a foreign land with economic opportunity. So it's important, I think, for the inter-American dialogue as it is, with its focus, as I was reading out there, as I sat there this morning, democratic governments, prosperity and social equality, every one of these things is spoken to by remittances, every one. And it's an important opportunity for us to step back and reflect on where we have common ground. They're in such a divisive atmosphere in Washington today, especially around the immigration issue, which is obviously a huge backdrop around this entire discussion. Where do we have common ground? We have common ground in a desire to fight criminality. MS-13 and that kind of transnational criminal activity is a cancer. It's a cancer that is best dealt with in open, transparent, above-ground monitoring of financial flows. Okay. Things that push or could push remittances into underground, under-the-table type channels, such as any kind of taxation on remittance flows or the difficulty in getting bank accounts and all the kinds of things that the industry has worried about for years, are not in the interest of the United States or of the host of the received country governments to be able to openly collaborate to fight criminality, which is in everyone's interest. It's in the interest of the good, hardworking people that have migrated and are sending money. It's in the interest of the United States law enforcement. It's in the interest of United States citizens and residents that want to live in peace and tranquility and not have the kinds of atrocities that are being committed by these transnational enterprises, 10 miles from here. So if you step back and think about the role that remittances play, and you think of them as a safety valve in a globalized economy, this is the way that families deal with globalization. When they cannot earn what they need to earn in order to survive in a country that doesn't provide, for various reasons, the level of economic opportunity, they need to be able to migrate and work. When employers in the United States need the labor should be able to meet that need. And I think, in spite of all of the negative rhetoric and the tendency towards extremism that we've heard in the immigration debate, we are seeing, some rays of hope that there really is an opportunity to coalesce around those things that bring us together as a country, those things that bring us together as a hemisphere. And remittances, to me, is at the heart of it. Maybe it's because of what I do, right? But it's at the heart of it. This is the connection that keeps families moving across countries and across completely different economic situations across the send and receive markets. So let me discuss a little bit, some of the specifics in the report, because I think there's some fascinating findings here. One is the significant effect of increased send amounts. And, I refer again there to Table 7 that Manuel referred to before, a big jump in the average send amount in Honduras, in Guatemala, and in Mexico, where the average send amount goes from $315 to $334. Given the size of the Mexican market, that is a very, very significant increase. Mexico attributed $1.6 billion of the overall increase of $6 billion over the 16 to 17 period. That's 25% of the increase, okay, one country. And mostly that's coming because of larger send amounts. Those larger send amounts are coming because Mexican migrants in the United States are doing better economically, because the U.S. economy is doing well, because jobs are there, because they're able to send more money. There was also a significant effect in the devaluation of the peso at the end of 2017. After the election of President Trump, the Mexican peso devalued in the day after the election, the single largest devaluation it had in over 10 years. And that, in the short run, means that $1 buys you many more pesos. So migrants are very smart. They live a binational economic existence, and there's an opportunity. It's a buy opportunity. They send money because it's a buy opportunity to buy the ability for their families to consume more or to invest more in that window when the exchange rate really reacted somewhat irrationally. After the inauguration, the exchange rate began to revalue and stabilized for a good period of 2017. But that burst at the end of 17 with a significantly devalued peso. We saw average send amounts go way up, and I think that was a large contributor to why the overall increase was as great as it was in Mexico. The other factors that really influence on the push side, violence and insecurity, you really cannot underestimate the significance of that in the Northern Triangle area, and people simply trying to put themselves in a position where they can live and earn in peace and provide for their families. The market does that. This report reflects in very broad macroeconomic statistical terms, really the combined effect of millions millions of difficult sacrifices that people make every day in order to transplant themselves and provide for their families. And it's as simple as that. So I'm very honored to be here and to be able to discuss this important work. I really commend the dialogue for continuing to lead the analysis of the remittance market and to be able to really be the one place where the various things the different strings that come together here, from business to diplomacy to macroeconomics and cross-border public policy issues, are brought together in a single place. We have industry conferences and everybody's networking. We have regulatory conferences and everybody's worried about the law enforcement side of things. But this is the one place where we can really come together and see this industry for what it is, as a true connector of our hemisphere in a fundamental way that is massive in its reach and massive in its importance. Thank you for the invitation. I guess the last thing I'd like to close on is just a couple of words about the immigration context and TPS, and as you mentioned, is a big issue that is pending. And I just hope that at this point we can find some common ground and get away from the divisive rhetoric and get away from the vilification and really try to focus on the needs of U.S. businesses, focus on the needs of our neighboring nations, the importance that these flows play in their GDP, understanding that it's in no one's interest to see these flows interrupted. It's in no one's interest to see massive deportations that further destabilize the receive countries' economies. And it's in no one's interest in the United States to see people that have been living and lawfully contributing to our economy and our society for decades to suddenly be uprooted and forced to return to countries that realistically, in spite of the good intentions of the Salvadorians, I'm sure it's going to be very, very difficult for them to absorb them in any meaningful way. So I think the comments that the president made yesterday about his personal thoughts on DACA and what's going to happen with the temporary reprieve that we've been given from the government shutdown are very, very heartening. I hope that those elements of the Republican Party that understand that this is to the benefit of the American public and of their constituents to find a solution that finds common ground, speak out, and don't leave the ground only to the most rabidly anti-immigrant elements of the party that have been, in my mind, an impediment to constructive progress. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you again for the
Thank you. Thanks very much, Paul. Thanks for your very good comments. Leon, you have the floor. It's on, yeah.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and quite a hard act to follow, both of you. So it's interesting. It's my pleasure to be here, and I have to congratulate you, Manuel. As you know, in the remittances space, I've been involved in it for 25 years, not in this hemisphere, in the rest. Although America, as the love of the world, has some big. I think we start saying Europe, where I'm based, there's a lot, as many of you will have seen, there's quite a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, which is sort of mixed with a desperate need to have migrants due to the aging population in the various countries. And so that's why we saw things such as Angela Merkel opening the doors to Germany to the Syrian refugees. As much as it was humanitarian, it was actually to solve a long-term issue that the Germans have in terms of how are we going to keep our country running and look after an aging population. Of course, that's led to populist sentiment, and just recently a country like Austria elected a very right-wing government on a broadly anti-immigrant platform. You look at where I'm from, the UK, I'm sure all of you have heard of Brexit. I think we're living through it at the moment. I couldn't tell you exactly what's going to happen, but it certainly caused a very divisive and quite acidic atmosphere in many ways, and the level of discussion has had nothing to do with facts and, at all, and all to do with people's perceptions. And I think it's a dangerous sort of precedent that we're going to have. Having said all of that, if you look at migration to Europe, it is still growing. It's shifted further along. So a couple of years ago and last year, most of the migrants were coming in through Greece and Italy in particular. Now it's moved further west, and there's a lot more coming along North Africa and up through Spain. And I think we'll see, and probably see, that impact on the Spanish economy as we move forward. I think it's really interesting when we look at some of the other regions as well. The Gulf states, I think many of you know, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and so on. Combined, that's the second largest sending region in the world. It's a region built on importing labor, basically, for specific projects and growth. But for the first time recently, there have been more restrictions on who's allowed in. Saudi Arabia is introducing taxes and so on. And I think generally there's a threat in that region that although migrants are really important and the remittances they send home are vital to the countries that they come from, which is predominantly India, Pakistan, Philippines, and so on. For the first time, there seems to be some threat as to how that's going to work going forward. And then you look at somewhere like Russia, which has always used people from neighboring countries. So Manuel, I think, mentioned Tajikistan, but the Commonwealth of Independent States and so on. They saw a decrease in the number of migrants, but now that's increasing again. And I think overall, there's a generally accepted view that migration will continue to grow. At the moment, it's supposed to be 258 million worldwide. That would be the official number. Unofficially, it will be much higher. And I think we will continue to see that coming. But the other thing to remember about the migration is that actually most migrants go from one developing country to another developing country. We always think they come from a developing country to a developed country. That's what the rhetoric is. But actually, if you look, it's actually more going from one developing country often to a neighboring one. So that's something else to sort of think about. I think if I look at the trends, I mean, it was really interesting, some of this data and what's driving it and so on, and average transaction values. To be honest, we just don't have that sort of level of information in most of the rest of the world to know whether the average is increasing or not. But when you talk to industry people, there are a number of factors that are influencing the remittances environment. One of them that you've alluded to is a whole area around regulation and know your customer activity. This is having some major impacts. It's been going on for a long time, but actually one of the impacts that we're getting around that is that the number of money transfer companies is actually, in a way, is reducing because there's more consolidation, because a lot of the smaller operators who were able to provide services to one community are finding it increasingly prohibitive to be able to continue to offer those services due in some part, not all, but some parts of compliance costs. And that's linked to de-risking, which I think some of you are familiar with as a term anyway. Paul, you mentioned it. This is really where money transfer companies, amongst others, have had their bank accounts closed in their own businesses' names. And without having a bank account, they can't actually continue to operate their service. That has affected many countries. I know the Caribbean's particularly badly affected. But actually, you find most places in Africa in particular, parts of Asia and small island states are particularly badly affected by this. And this doesn't just affect the small money transfer operators, this affects the large ones across the board. There's a general perception amongst some of the large global banks in particular that money transfers is a dangerous business, it's not commercially viable, and we shouldn't be in it. And I think that's one of the things we need to find a solution to broadly on a global level. It's not something you can do country by country. So that's, if you like, a pressure on the industry. I think one of the interesting statistics you came out with there, Manuel, was around the level of automation. That has really been talked about a lot. How can we harness technology to actually improve the way people send their money? And part of the context for that is, I think you're probably all familiar with the Sustainable Development Goal 10.C, which says that the overall cost of remittances, or the average, by 2030 should be no more than 3%, and in any individual corridor, no more than 5%. Now, if you talk to most money transfer companies, they would probably tell you they would love to be able to make 7%, maybe even 3%, Paul, I don't know. But the World Bank current measure is 7.09%. So there's quite a sort of gap to come down. But one of the ways that could happen is with technology. And it's interesting that in Latin America, or these transactions you were talking about, 9% of people now use the internet or mobile to transfer money. And I think if you look at commonly some of the analysts' numbers, that's pretty similar to that. It actually seems to me quite surprisingly low, and I would have thought it probably should be able to increase significantly over time. And the advantage for operators is you don't have to manage as large, expensive agent networks. So you should be able to make cost savings which can be passed on to consumers. We recently did some research actually on why people still use cash-based services to transfer money in the UK, where 95% of people have a bank account, and nearly everybody, absolutely, pretty much everybody now gets paid directly into that. And yet, if you look in the UK, over 90% of people are still using cash. So we have a silly situation, in a sense, where somebody gets money paid into their bank account, they go to an ATM, withdraw the cash from that bank account, walk into a money transfer agent, give the cash to that agent, who then transfers it through their online system to somebody at the receiving end, and then that agent has to then get rid of that cash somehow. Sometimes it's even more silly because they'll have an ATM in the agent, and the person takes the money out of the ATM, gives it to the shopkeeper, and then goes and puts it back in the ATM, which is just mad, but that's what's happening. When we actually, so we researched different African communities to see why they were doing this. And there's a number of reasons. Undoubtedly, there's a generational element to it. But actually a lot, surprisingly to me, seem to be driven by what is the state of technology in the country they're sending to. And if you think logically about it, actually, there's not really a correlation between how I pay for my service in the UK and how the person in Kenya, for instance, collects their money. All I'm doing is giving the person in the UK the money, the agent, they put it into the system, and then it could go into a bank account, it could be collected in cash, it could be credited to a mobile wallet. But the consumer behavior, the conclusion broadly was that it's driven by what is the environment in the receive country, which I think raises and poses lots of questions, but it's just an interesting phenomenon. But over time, I suspect we'll see that automation changes quite a lot. The other thing is that just on pricing, the GSMA last year, we helped them, they produced some data that showed sending money from mobile to mobile compared to traditional remittances could save up to 50% if somebody kept the money in their wallet at the other end, or at least 28% even if they collected cash at the other end. So they're doing more work to find out why that is, but mobile certainly seems to be something that could force a change in this industry, and be interesting to get your guys' perspective on that later. I think the only other point I would say, and perhaps coming back more to the KYC and regulation viewpoint, is there is a continual, in my view, dangerous rhetoric around taxation and remittances. It almost seems that when a country that has a large number of migrants is looking for a way to improve their economy, almost the first group they look at is the people who are transferring money and talk about raising taxes. And to my mind, that's a silly idea, partially because it's probably not fair, but actually, more importantly, because it won't work. And the reason it won't work is because people will then send money through informal methods. And I think there's enough evidence around to show that that continues to be the case. And somehow we need to make sure we work with governments and politicians that keep looking at this idea to explain the cause and effect, and that it will be totally counterproductive. So, Michael, I might stop there because otherwise I'll go on all day.
That was great. That was great, Leon. Very, very useful, and to have that sort of broader global perspective, I think, is extremely valuable. So, thank you very much for those thoughts. We're going to open it up. If I could just maybe start, just to ask Manuel just one question, and then we'll invite other comments. I mean, there are two countries coming back to the Americas that weren't part of the study, but I think are of interest. And just wondering if you could share the storyline on Cuba and Venezuela remittances, to the extent that you have reliable information. What changes, if any, have we seen in 2017, and what will we expect this year? Do you have any thoughts?
Well, with Cuba, definitely there is an increase in migration, and that's being observed in terms of the so-called extracontinentals. The Cubans that have come through Central America, particularly through Costa Rica, coming from Ecuador, then crossing the border all the way to Costa Rica, and then coming to Mexico. I think the number is over 25,000 have come across in last year. Other than that, Cuban migration has continued. There is being an increase also in Ecuador itself, Cuban staying in the country. The other development is that of Venezuela, and that has definitely shown a dramatic increase in migration. The numbers are unclear. A recent survey done in Venezuela showed an estimate of 4 million migrants. The figure may be a little too high, but when we looked at other studies that have been done over the past 5 years, there's been definitely an increase in the number of households with a relative who has left, from 9% of the number of households to 14% in just 3 years. And that amounts to at least 2 million people. When you look at the stories and the data collected by different host countries, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica, the numbers actually tell a lot on the hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans who have left and gone to those countries. And in the United States, I think Venezuela is one of the major nationalities applying for asylum in the United States, in the thousands. So this has significant implications. We're actually doing a survey, a study in Colombia to Venezuelans there, and trying to explore the extent to which they're also sending money back home. In terms of remittances, in our experience, not most of the cases, in most of the times, when you have a country in a severe political crisis, people are not sending money like in the other economies, but they're actually sending goods to take care of their families. And that's basically the pattern going on in Venezuela. We have seen some surveys that say that 30% are sending money, but that's, even if that's too small, we'll consider that there are over 600,000 Venezuelans in Colombia. So, that number is telling you that at least 200,000 transactions are going to that country. That's just from one place. But then the concentration of Venezuelans in Chile, in Peru, it's estimated there are at least 70,000 Venezuelans in Ecuador, will tell you that at some point they are going to start sending money.
Thank you. Why don't we open it up, and if you could just tell us who you are, and wait for a microphone, and be brief, and we'll get a few questions, and then we'll go back to the panelists. Thank you.
Hi there. Hello. Hey, my name is Paul Denage. I support the Department of State's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. So you had spoken about how the peso was devalued at the beginning of 2017 by the course of a political event. Can you speak about how either migration has been affected in similar ways, or how political events inside countries, such as the Honduran election in 2017, has affected either migration or remittances?
Thank you. Yes, sir. Back there? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Leonardo Ayala. I'm here representing ECLAC. Could you provide insight on the composition of jobs held by the over 300,000 TPS workers here, and explain the impact of TPS renouncement on the U.S. economy, specifically on wage growth, given that we're already operating in an environment of stagnant wage growth, shortage of workers, and an aging environment?
Thank you. Yes, there was another question over here. Yeah. Then we'll go here afterwards. Over here. Get the microphone, and then we'll come back. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rene Pinilla. So I'm wondering what is behind Nicaragua's high remittance growth, given the economic growth that the country has experienced compared to the Central American neighbors, and its lower crime rate.
Okay, thanks. And then this gentleman, and then we'll go take another round.
Walter Batres from Red Migrante Guatemalteca. First of all, comment. This the dialogue has an idea of all the amount of people that are dying trying to migrate to the United States, and the problem that has been created to bring those bodies, dead bodies, back to their countries. I don't know if you have looked into that to establish a fund or to work with some of the governments that are partially supporting to bring those dead bodies back. And the question for follow you, it's what is your opinion on a possible tax on remittances from the Trump administration? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, do you want to start, and then see if Paul can?
Thanks. Definitely there is a relationship between politics and migration, but it's not, the timing of it is not really straight. If an event like the political crisis in Honduras occurs, automatically it's not going to lead to migration. But it's something that will be seen within 6 months past the event. Just to give a general estimate of the effect. For example, during the 2009 military coup in Honduras, the upsurge of migration was seen quite later in the stage, over 6 to 9 months afterwards. In fact, the higher migration rate was seen once the country entered into a formal electoral process, and there was an alleged political transition in the country. But the pattern is related to, at least it triggers some outflow of migration over a short period of time. When the political situation is continued, then it becomes basically a pattern, and that's the correlation we see between state fragility and migration. With regards to the peso, this is the relationship between remittance sending and exchange rates. It's, in my opinion, through my research, is inconclusive because it depends on some countries. For example, when the rupee in India devaluates, migrants tend to send more. In historical trends, when we looked at the peso, the Mexican peso, when the peso devaluates, migrants will not remit, will actually stay at the same amount. But what we're looking at now, in the past 2017, was the opposite. It was when the peso gained strength, migrants had to send more money. And so you see different patterns going on that are hard to generalize on. But definitely, what it tells you is that people are sensitive to exchange rate fluctuations, and the reasons they do, depend on how you see the environment. With regards to the composition of jobs, in general, the labor composition, the occupations that migrants on TPS have is relatively similar to all other migrants. And just to put in some perspective, the two major occupations that migrants have are construction and domestic work. Over 20% of male migrants work in construction, and over 25% of female migrants work in domestic work. In relationship to the US economy, only 4% of the US population actually works in construction, and less than 1% of the US population works as a domestic work or in housekeeping activities. So there is a huge, a fundamental complementarity between the foreign labor force that is in the US economy and the demand for labor in general in the US economy. So this is really something that most politicians don't realize, the depth of the complementarity, because when basically 4 out of 10 migrants actually are working in 2 economic activities that represent only 5% of the entire occupations in the labor force, it's outstanding. Given the fact that the US economy is basically at one of its better performing periods over the past 5-10 years, the demand for foreign labor is definitely an effective one. And overall, what we see, especially with unauthorized workers, is that for businesses, they represent a major, I'm not sure if it's a savings, but they definitely are not spending over 26% of labor costs that they should be spending on the actual earnings that they're supposed to pay to most migrants, to most people. And that supports a lot of the businesses that are that experience low productivity, for example, in the hospitality industries or in certain services. With regards to Nicaragua, the growth of remittances is mostly associated to a pattern in labor migration to Costa Rica predominantly. At least 17,000 Nicaraguans go to work on a regular basis every year to Costa Rica. And I mean, they have a 100% success rate of entering. You know, on the one hand, you have 70,000 Hondurans trying to come to the US, and maybe 25 to 30,000 make it. On the other hand, you have about 20,000 Nicaraguans going to Costa Rica, and 20,000 make it. So these are patterns. There is a demand for significant labor in Costa Rica for these workers in construction, in security, in domestic work, and in agriculture. So that explains substantially the increase. Another factor that is explaining the increase is migration to Spain. It's something of a paradox, but while the Spanish economy went down after the economic recession and it struggled to recover even today, migration from South America basically didn't increase to Spain. But migration of Central Americans, especially from El Salvador and Nicaragua and Guatemala, actually has increased in large numbers. There are at least 15,000 Nicaraguans living in Spain that basically mostly left since 2010. So, you know, it's one of those fascinating facts of how does that make sense? You know, the country has 25% unemployment rate, and yet you have all this flow of people coming from El Salvador and Nicaragua going there. And finally, with regards to, I think you mean the people who die in the United States, not trying to cross the border. This is, I mean, it's hard to tell. It's a demographic question, but we know that one of the problems that you're dealing with is the return of the body. And there are some businesses that offer some sort of support for that, but there are cultural biases in at least in Latin American society. It's something different with African society. That you don't want to buy, for example, a body repatriation insurance. which is something that will protect you quite well in the event of a catastrophic event. So we don't know exactly how many people die. And, I mean, the statistics is there. I don't have it at hand. And then the people who die crossing the border is also quite a substantive number. How many? The Mexican government has some statistics of more than 1,000 people dying every year trying to cross the border. The number is actually higher than that. In some cases, it's as high as the homicide rates in their home countries. But it's never that high.
Thanks. Paul, you want to add anything to any of these issues? I think
most of the questions were addressed far better than I could. I think one question that was asked was about the potential for taxation. And I think that when various proposals for taxing remittances have been raised, and they've been raised for years and years at the state level and at the federal level, and always and correctly, in my view, not gone forward because they're simply bad policy. And when people sit back and look at the facts and the potential implications of taxation, either on the send side or the receive side, and analyze them dispassionately, everyone realizes that although it's a great soundbite, it's fundamentally bad policy. So I'm confident that the intelligent people that will analyze any such proposal, if and when made, will come to the same conclusion that they have for the last 15 years.
Thank you. Leon, do any of these issues resonate with some of the debates globally on these, like devaluation or?
Yeah, I think the exchange rate
issue
is certainly an issue that we see in many countries, and I think with Manuel's right, it's actually quite hard to. It is inconclusive, the behaviour, but typically what we see is that if the receiver's currency appreciates, often the senders don't send as much for a period of time. I mean, one of the things is most people sending money are pretty experts on exchange rates, actually. But they also, at some point, think that they know better than the market. So they just assume that if the rate's gone in one direction, it will come back. And if they hold off and don't send, then it will be better for them. But at a certain point, they have to send money. At the end of the day, they're sending money to people who depend on that. So they may hold off for a little period of time, but because they have to get money there, normally their behavior is, if it's more expensive, they'll delay. On the other hand, what you've seen with Mexico, we see quite often when the receiver's currency depreciates, there's quite a big rush from senders to come in, particularly if they think it's a short-term feature. So they all become currency speculators. In those cases, they'll quite often borrow money to send it in anticipation that actually it will be more expensive a little while later. But the total they send is probably the same over an annualized period. It's just they may send more money one month and less money the next month to pick it up.
Paul? I wanted to carry on the exchange rate issue and perhaps add a couple of thoughts on the question about Venezuela and make a point about the impact of controlled exchange rates and the difference between a controlled rate and the free market rate. The reason you see no remittances one of the reasons you see no remittances reflected to Venezuela is that if we, for example, were to send money to Venezuela, the amount that the recipient would receive, because we will only deal with a licensed entity that is complying with local law, is a fraction of what they would receive in the black market. And so remittances are happening, but they're happening in informal ways, which are hugely expensive to the recipient, but much, much better, nevertheless, than they would get transacting through the official market. So when you have these enormous distortions between a controlled theoretical rate with a licensed structure to obtain Forex and a black market where the rate is or a free market, however you want to look at it, where the rate is much higher, money will flow and people will do rational things. And you have a vibrant economy along the Colombia-Venezuela border where, all kinds of barter is going on and money moves in funny ways. So when you have distortions, they're reflected in the statistics. The money's still going, but it's going underground and in a way that is extremely expensive for the sender and insecure.
Great, thank you. Why don't we take a few more questions? And oh my God, okay. Why don't we start here, and then we'll go to the ambassador. Oh, okay. Please be very brief, and you don't have to disguise your comment as a question. If you want to just make a comment. That wasn't directed to you. It's a general point.
I don't think it's
okay.
Is it okay?
It's okay. Yeah, it's perfect. Yeah.
You finished?
I'm finished. You have the floor.
It's a question?
You have the floor.
Jerry Butler from the Bahamas. Doubling up on what Paul was saying, I wonder to what extent you can estimate that the statistics here have not in fact captured the complete universe of remittances, meaning you would say the data accounts for what percentage of you think is real remittances. And then second, doubling up on a question from Michael in the very beginning about Colombia to Venezuela. To what extent are these remittances numbers only focused on outbound funds from the US to other countries? And is there any analysis available on intra-regional remittances? For example, what Michael was talking about Colombia to Venezuela. I speak like for, say, my country, the Bahamas, where we had a $4 billion Chinese project, the largest Chinese investment in the Western Hemisphere. I could never find data, even though they employ 12,000 laborers from China, on the remittances from the Bahamas to China. And then there's significant remittances from the Bahamas for medical emergencies in the US and education emergencies. I wanted to know the purpose of remittances, if there's any data for inbound remittances to the US, what was the captured scope of the major purposes, because sometimes that wipes out the outbound little remittances from migrant workers, et cetera. And then the last question was on de-risking and the effect on the Caribbean. You alluded to that initially, Leon. But I mean, like if granular information, like say Western Union, which closed down Western Union in the Bahamas, closed down Western Union in the Cayman Islands, which funded remittances to Haiti and to Jamaica substantially. Now a cash airplane flies out. We can't tell you when because someone might hijack the plane. But does Western Union provide information on how much money would have been lost when they shut down those branches? I'm done. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you very much for those good questions, comments. Back. Why don't we take those two and then we'll go over here. We're going to collect them, but yeah, please.
Very quick. My name is Maria Victoria Abreu. I was wondering if you have the remittances data disaggregated by the legal status of the sender.
Thank you. Yes.
Good morning. I wanted to know if there's any breakdown of remittances going for purely consumption versus migrants that are anticipating being deported, or any other philosophy towards investment. And then collaboration, I know, was going on at one time with different levels of Mexican state and local governments to collaborate with the remittances and do more public projects.
Okay, great. Ambassador?
Excuse me. Yes. Manuel, I have a question regarding the Cuba market. If you have any estimates of the size, and we know the black market or the informal market is big, so if you have any estimates of the share.
Thank you. Ambassador?
Timothy Towell, 31 years in the State Department. I have a real question. What do we do with all this wonderful information we just learned, besides dialogue about it? What do we do tomorrow? I have an answer. Take Paul Dwyer, who made it very clear, get him out of his office, take him down to the White House where there's some challenged people on issues, but are supported reportedly by capitalists, investors. people who own businesses and who hire labor and have them educate those challenged people on those issues. Let somebody take them up to the Chamber of Commerce where they believe that, up to the Hill where we have challenged people and Republicans who are noisy on the morning talk shows. Take them down clandestinely, you've got a coat and tie on, to Fox News, have them smile, and then hit them because they're 100% wrong on the capitalist Republican labor issues. And then let's win that, and then do what we did in the kindergarten, repeat it and repeat it and repeat it.
Thank you for that comment. You don't have to hold back if you don't want to. Why don't I get these two, and then we'll go back to our panel.
Sarah Baumick with CSIS Americas program. Just one more minute back on Venezuela. I know last year in your 2016 report, I believe you estimated about $1 billion in remittances. And I was wondering, is that no longer an accurate statement? And then also looking forward to the future, I was wondering, with Maduro's Petro and also other cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology, how you guys foresee that being used in the money transfer.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Maria Alejandra Silva. I'm from WOLA. And I was wondering what information you have on the demographics of people sending remittances, socioeconomic status, gender, ethnicity, age breakdown, all that.
We're going to have another session, I think, but why don't we see what we can do real quickly. Start with Leon Paul, and we'll give Manuel the final word.
Well, that's good, because there was hardly any questions for me, so that which was good. See, now your problem, Manuel.
Well, there was on a comment.
Yeah, no, I'll come to the problem with that last question is you've given them some data, and now everybody wants everything. It's better not to give any data, and then you don't get bombarded with other requests. So I think, Thierry, you asked me, do I know how much money has been lost or tied up or impacted via the de-risking? The short answer is I don't. We do have a representative of Western Union here, and I'm sure they're not going to publish a number. Are you?
No, we aren't going to publish a number, but we have been very involved. There are actually 3 countries that were de-risked in the Caribbean at the same time. One of them was Bahamas, and Bahamas stayed closed for the longest period of time, about 4 times the length of the other 2 countries that were de-risked at that time. And one of the recommendations that we made in our work with the local central banks was what can be done at the central bank level to really show that your supervisory capacity and processes are what is expected from U.S. banking institutions, correspondent banking institutions, because that was part of the driver. And so there was a significant amount of legitimate, regulated flows that stopped. That doesn't mean that money didn't and doesn't still get on planes through. So that's the one thing I'm going to leave you with, rather than a number, which we don't make public, is that it takes work with the central banks to turn around these kinds of situations. And we hope that they will continue to partner more in changing the outlook for de-risking in the Caribbean, because beyond the Bahamas, there are a lot of countries that have been and still are on the edge, not just at the remittance company level, but at the core central bank level. So,
yeah,
thank you.
Thanks, Bob. So the short answer is no, don't have a number, but there are a number of studies out there, either analysing the process or what needs to be done with it. Actual data is harder to come by for a variety of reasons, but there is some information out there on that. The other point I thought I might just address was your point about the Chinese and why you don't see any data. I mean, we see this a lot in the work we do in Africa as well. As you know, there are so many projects funded by the Chinese in Africa. Many of the countries in Africa, it's actually not legally allowed to transfer money out of the country anyway. So what tends to happen with the Chinese there is that they are paid in China directly at source, if you like, by the construction companies or so on. So it doesn't actually appear as if it's a remittance going from Tanzania or whatever. I don't know if that's the case with the Bahamas, but I would imagine that it probably is, something like that. The Chinese tend to keep their earnings very much on the mainland of China and provide some expenses to the employees who are constructing, but the idea is they're only there for a limited period of time and their income is really paid back home.
Thank you, Leon. Paul, any thoughts?
Well, as you said, Michael, there's a ton there, but I'll talk about two quick themes. One is the regulatory approach and the different levels of regulatory approach, and the second is new technologies, including blockchain issues or blockchain opportunities. We live in a world where the regulators are mostly focused on an international banking system that's based on a hub and spoke correspondent bank model. And there's a lot that's built into that is not just about the way that settlement happens, but it's about the way that compliance happens. And there's a lot of trust that's been built up over the years between the regulators and the major banks to ensure that the banks are policing the flow of funds cross-border. So there's great comfort in a settlement system that involves centralization with correspondent banks, and that creates choke points. No, I didn't mean to use that term, but it creates points where regulatory pressure can have unintended consequences, such as the de-risking of entire populations and the forcing of legitimate transactions into informal channels. Blockchain has the potential to reinvent that system. It's nascent. There are too many innovations bundled together right now. A huge volatility in the crypto assets that could be used to provide trustless settlement between counterparts that doesn't require a centralized clearinghouse in the way that international banking currently works. But because of the volatility in the underlying asset, it's very difficult to use that, certainly on a retail level. And on a wholesale level, although great progress has been made, you still have to deal with that possibility that the asset fluctuates very, very quickly within a minute to use it as a settlement chain. Having said all of that, I think regulators at the highest levels are focused appropriately on the de-risking issue. The Financial Stability Board has convened one of the best meetings I've attended in 15 years in Copenhagen a couple of weeks ago to focus, the top level regulators from Europe and from the United States and the decision makers in the largest banks to really try to find solutions. And again here, the theme is common ground, common ground. Let's get away from the extremes. Let's get away from, the rhetoric and get down to solutions. And I think there are some, and these discussions really help advance them.
Thanks. Manuel, final word.
Yeah, the common ground is essential because, on the issue of regulation and de-risking, it's being based mostly on assumptions and perceptions of risk rather than the threat, the financial threat itself. And there hasn't been much proof within regulators to really show that there is an actual threat for example, in the Caribbean countries. So they respond to signals rather than facts. Like Leon says, the Chinese mechanism is not unique to China. There are other countries that have applied that. Cubans, for example, have paid their workers that go to Venezuela. There were over 15,000 Cuban workers in Venezuela, doctors, nurses, etc., who were get paid in Cuba. The same process has occurred with the Chinese. So how does that record within the balance of payments according to the IMF statistics? It's called workers' compensation. But there is not a regional, at the nation level, some statistic that shows how much money is actually getting out. In terms of statistics of outbound money transfers from from Latin America, I can provide you with the numbers. There is some estimate of how much money goes out from the Latin American region and how much money comes in. We estimate about 22 million transactions on a monthly basis going to Latin America and the Caribbean. 75% more or less is originated in the US. About 15% is actually increasingly originating from within Latin America and the Caribbean. Dominican Republic, some of the English Caribbean, sending, for example, sometimes Trinidad, Guyanese, sending from Trinidad to Guyana. Colombia now is becoming a major sender. Chile, which was little known for a long time, Brazil are examples. Costa Rica also is a major example in that context. We do have the statistics of the legal status of migrants in general, and I'll be happy to share it with you. It depends on the nationality, basically. If you average it, if you look at the aggregate, it's about 45% unauthorized workers. But of course, if you looked at it at different nationalities, it changes. With the other statistics, that's a difficult one to get a sense of. It's hard to tell whether the increase in remittances is basically risk mitigation rather than just sending more money over there in case I'm deported. I think there are subtle differences of what that means for a person who is sending money. But it's really difficult to make sense of it. What to do? What to do tomorrow? We are working along those lines. We're trying to, as a dialogue entity, we're trying to bring together all sectors, all political views, and positions and opinions with facts. Unfortunately, these discussions don't deal with facts necessarily, but with how you believe the world should look like. And so that's where the real struggle is. How do you frame an argument that tries to offer a robust explanation of reality that actually can work against you with a morally defensible statement at the same time? And that's, we're trying to do with some migrant groups like under TPS. So with Venezuela, we withhold the number because we realized that the 1 billion estimate, which we based it on UN statistics, was really not that representative. So we are basically going back to the drawing board, doing surveys and interviews to Venezuelans in Colombia, in Chile, and also we're going to do an online survey to the diaspora to get a sense.
Great. Well, this is, as usual, Manuel, you've stimulated a great discussion, and there are a lot of issues out there, and we're just going to have to do a lot more of these events. I think they're extremely useful, and hopefully this has been of great interest to all of you. I want to thank everybody for joining us for this event. And Leon, thank you very much. Hope you come back to the States on this side of the Atlantic. You'll come by and continue to share your thoughts with us at the dialogue. You're always welcome here. Paul, it's great to have you with us again. And Manuel, congratulations. And thank you very much for this great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.